I moved into the apartment next to Mr. Greaves at the beginning of June, right after my breakup. The place wasn't much to look at. Thin walls, beige carpets, old appliances that buzzed when you turned them on. But it was cheap, quiet, and available on short notice. The kind of space you tell yourself is temporary, even though part of you knows you'll probably be there for a while. My neighbor, Mr. Greaves, lived in the unit directly across the hall. I met him on my second day there when I was carrying boxes in from my car. He was in his late 60s, maybe older, thin with a small stoop in his shoulders. He wore the same gray cardigan every time I saw him and spoke in a soft, careful voice that made him sound older than he looked. "You just moved in?" he asked that first day. I nodded, and he smiled politely, like someone who didn't get much company but still knew how to be decent. We only spoke for a few minutes, small talk mostly, rent prices, weather, how quiet the building usually was. Before going back inside, he said, "If you ever need sugar or anything, I'm next door," and gave a small wave. That was the first and last proper conversation we ever had. A few nights later, around 10 p.m., I noticed a faint blue glow coming from under his door. At first I thought maybe he'd left a lamp on, but then I heard it, the low, constant hum of his television. It was one of those old tube TVs, the kind that made a soft electric buzz when running. The sound was barely noticeable through the wall, but when the building got quiet late at night, it stood out. I didn't mind at first. I even found it comforting, a small reminder that someone else was awake nearby. That feeling didn't last long. By the third week, I started to realize something strange. The TV never turned off, not once. Morning, afternoon, 3 a.m. It was always playing. Sometimes I'd hear muffled voices through the wall, sometimes static, sometimes the high-pitched tone of dead air when a channel went out. I'd wake up at odd hours and hear the faint hum again, like a heartbeat under the drywall. I told myself maybe he was one of those older guys who fell asleep with the TV on every night. But even when I left for work in the morning, it would still be on. And when I came back home 12 hours later, still humming. After about a week of this, curiosity got the better of me. One evening, I decided to knock on his door. It was a little after 9. The light under the door was flickering. The TV was definitely on. I waited, counted to 10. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. I leaned closer, trying to make out any movement, but there was only the static sound bleeding through the wood. I finally gave up and went back inside, figuring he'd fallen asleep again. Over the next few days, I tried not to think about it. But once you notice something like that, you can't unnotice it. The constant glow through the crack under his door, the hum that seemed to seep into my apartment even when everything else was silent, it started to feel invasive. I began turning my own TV on just to drown it out. Then one morning, while taking out the trash, I realized his door had a small pile of mail pushed up against it. Same envelopes from earlier in the week still there. That was odd. I mentioned it casually to our landlord, a heavyset guy named Carl who managed a few of the units. "Mr. Greaves?" he said, shrugging. "He's fine. Old man's always glued to that TV. Probably hasn't noticed his mail yet." His tone told me not to worry, but there was something dismissive about it, like he'd already had this conversation before. That night, I woke up to a sharp sound that didn't belong. It was like a single loud thump from the other side of the wall. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The TV was still on, but now the volume seemed higher. I could make out the dialogue. Something about a detective, maybe an old movie. I waited, half expecting to hear movement, but there was nothing else, just that movie playing on repeat. The next morning, the air in the hallway smelled faintly stale, like something had gone bad in the vents. I noticed it as soon as I stepped outside my door. It wasn't strong, but it lingered. By that afternoon, it was worse. When I came home from work, the entire floor smelled like rotting food. I saw Carl in the hallway, holding a rag to his face and muttering curses as he tried to unlock Mr. Greaves's door. "About damn time someone called me," he grumbled when he saw me. "Place smells like a sewer." I wanted to tell him I hadn't called anyone, but the words caught in my throat. He banged on the door a few times, then slid his key in and pushed it open. The TV was still running. The smell hit first. It was thick, almost tangible, like burnt meat and mold. Carl swore under his breath and covered his nose as he stepped inside. I stayed in the doorway. The apartment was dim, the only light coming from the flickering TV. On the screen was a black and white western, the sound loud enough to echo down the hall. And there, slumped in a recliner facing it, was Mr. Greaves. Carl froze in the doorway. He muttered something I couldn't make out and backed into the hall, face pale. I don't think he'd ever seen a dead body before. Neither had I. I didn't go any closer, but I could see enough from where I stood. Mr. Greaves was sitting perfectly upright in his recliner, one hand still resting on the armrest, eyes open, fixed on the glowing screen. The TV's light flickered over his face, washing it pale blue and gray, like he'd been sitting there watching the same image for hours, maybe days. Carl called 911 while I waited outside. Within minutes, the hallway was crowded, paramedics, police, the coroner. They moved quickly and quietly, their voices low, almost respectful. I caught a glimpse as they pulled a sheet over him. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. The heat had been on low, which probably slowed things down, but the smell had finally given him away. When they carried him out, the TV was still playing. Some old sitcom now, laugh track echoing through the apartment as if mocking the silence. One of the officers leaned over and unplugged it. The hum stopped, and for the first time since I'd moved in, the hallway felt truly quiet. The police asked a few questions. When I'd last seen him, if I'd noticed anything strange, if he had any visitors. I told them about the TV being on all the time, how I'd knocked but never gotten an answer. One of the officers nodded. Not uncommon, he said. Sometimes they just go quietly. No one knows until the smell starts. That line stuck with me for days. After they left, Carl taped a notice to Mr. Greaves's door. Unit sealed. Do not enter. The TV, the smell, the man himself. Everything was gone, but the silence that replaced it wasn't comforting. It felt wrong. Hollow. That low hum that used to annoy me had somehow become part of the building's rhythm. Without it, the nights felt unnaturally still. A few days later, cleaning crews came through. I watched them from my peephole. 2 guys in gloves and masks hauling out black trash bags, scrubbing the floors, repainting the doorframe. They carried out the recliner too, wrapped in plastic, as if it might infect them. When they finished, the place looked normal again. By the end of the week, the smell was gone, and the hallway air felt clean. But I couldn't relax. It started with faint sounds, soft static coming through the wall at night. I told myself it was my imagination, that my brain had just gotten used to that noise. Sometimes when you lose a sound you've heard for so long, your mind keeps filling it in, like phantom ringing after a concert. But the sound wasn't consistent. It would fade in, then out, like someone turning a dial. One night around 2 a.m., I sat up in bed because I swore I heard a voice, muffled, like a line of dialogue from an old movie. I turned off my phone, the fridge, even my fan. The sound was still there. The next morning, I asked Carl if someone had gone in to test the apartment. He frowned. No one's been in there since the cleanup crew left, he said. It's empty. Why? I told him I thought I heard something. He chuckled dryly. Old building. The pipes echo. Don't lose sleep over it. But I was losing sleep. The noise kept coming back. Always at night, always faint, but clear enough to recognize that rhythm of speech, that static hum. And sometimes, if I turned off my lights, I could see a flicker through the thin gap under Mr. Greaves's door. A pale, bluish light. I told myself it had to be something else. Maybe a reflection, or light bleeding from another apartment. Still, I couldn't help checking the outlet near my wall. It was cold to the touch, no power running through it. 2 nights later, I woke up to the same sound again, louder this time. Static, then what sounded like a commercial jingle from the 1980s, cheerful and tinny. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. I knew what it was. I'd heard that exact sound before, the kind of fuzzy, distorted audio that only came from old TV reruns. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and opened the recording app. The screen glowed white in the darkness, and I pressed record. I held it against the wall and waited. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then faintly, the static returned. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, followed by a voice. Low, mumbled, but definitely human. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't just random noise. Someone was speaking. When I replayed the clip later, the voice sounded closer than I remembered. Too close. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch until dawn, lights on, recording again and again. Sometimes I caught nothing. Other times, the faint hum would appear for a few seconds before cutting out abruptly, like someone was turning the power on and off. By the end of the week, I stopped pretending it was my imagination. There was something happening in that apartment. I wasn't sure if it was electrical interference or if someone had broken in and was using it as a hideout. All I knew was that the noise only started after they took his body away. I thought about calling the police again, but what would I even say? Hi, my dead neighbor's TV turned itself back on. They'd laugh, or worse, think I was losing it. So I decided to prove it myself. That Friday night, I stayed home from work and waited until the building went quiet. Around midnight, I stepped into the hallway. It was dark, except for the faint emergency light above the stairwell. The air smelled like cleaning products, but underneath it lingered something faintly metallic, like dust and wires. I walked up to Mr. Greaves's door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then, there it was. The soft crackle of static. I don't know what I expected to hear when I pressed my ear to that door. Maybe the soft hiss of air through the vents or a creak from the pipes. But it wasn't that. It was the unmistakable low static of a television on a dead channel. Faint but steady, like someone was watching from just a few feet away. I leaned closer, barely breathing. The sound grew sharper, and underneath it I could hear something else. Soft murmurs, too muffled to make out. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. That apartment was sealed. There was no power. No one living there. I stepped back, staring at the door like it might open on its own. The lock still had the city's yellow seal sticker across it. It wasn't broken, just old and curling at the edges. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and checked the crack under the door. Nothing. Just the faintest glimmer of blue light that flickered once and went dark. My throat went dry. I told myself it was leftover light from my own phone, reflecting weirdly off the linoleum. But I knew that was a lie. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on that door until I was inside my apartment again. I locked it and sat on the couch with every light on. I must have stared at the wall for an hour, waiting for the sound to come back. But it didn't. The rest of the night was silent. Too silent. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. The next day, I told Carl what I heard. He sighed, clearly tired of my complaints. Man, there's no one in there. The power's off. Maybe you've got rats in the wall or something. He laughed a little, but it wasn't mean, just dismissive. Still, he promised to check the meter that afternoon. Later, he knocked on my door, showing me a photo from the utility panel. No power draw from that unit at all, he said. Zero. Whatever you're hearing, it's not coming from there. That should have reassured me. It didn't. If anything, it made the whole thing worse. 2 nights later, the sound came back, louder this time. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a burst of static that made my window rattle. I sat up, listening. It faded for a second, then shifted into something else. An old commercial jingle, cheerful and warped, like it was coming through water. Then a man's voice, calm and steady. Don't touch that dial. The words repeated once, twice, then cut to silence. I lay frozen, my eyes on the wall between our apartments. The air felt heavier somehow. I picked up my phone and started recording again, just like before. I wanted proof. But when I played the clip back, there was nothing but silence, not even a trace of background noise. That's when I noticed the smell again, faint but unmistakable. That sweet metallic odor I thought was gone. It was seeping through the vents. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to see inside that apartment. Maybe someone had broken in, or maybe something was wrong with the wiring. Either way, I couldn't live next to that sound another night. I waited until evening, when Carl went out for a smoke. I told him I'd left something in the storage closet down the hall, just to keep him distracted. Then I walked straight to Mr. Greaves's door. The yellow sticker was still there, curling slightly at the corner. I hesitated, heart pounding, and pressed my thumb against it. It tore with barely any resistance. The lock clicked open with one slow turn. The smell hit me first. Damp, sour, mixed with something faintly chemical, like cleaner and old air. The apartment was dark, but I could see the outlines of furniture from the faint light coming through the window. Everything was in the exact same place I remembered. The recliner, the little side table, the TV against the far wall, except the TV was unplugged. The cord hung loose, coiled like a dead snake. I stepped inside slowly, every floorboard creaking under my shoes. The carpet still had dark stains where they'd scrubbed. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't been touched in weeks. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at that unplugged television. Its screen reflected just enough light for me to see my own pale face staring back. Then the static started again. It wasn't loud this time, more like a faint whisper. The kind of hiss you'd hear if you pressed your ear against a seashell. I looked around, trying to find the source. The TV was definitely off. The power cord was cold in my hand, but the sound was still there, coming from somewhere deep inside the room. I turned toward the recliner. That's when I noticed something wedged between the cushion and the armrest, a small portable radio, the old kind with a metal antenna. It was on, just barely. The dial sat between two frequencies, broadcasting nothing but static. I exhaled in relief and almost laughed. I must have bumped it when I walked in. I switched it off and tossed it on the table. The noise stopped instantly. For the first time in weeks, the place was quiet again. I stood there, smiling to myself, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I heard a soft click behind me, the kind a TV makes when it powers on. I froze. The room filled with a dim, bluish glow. I turned around slowly. The television screen was lit, pale static dancing across it. The cord was still hanging loose. I hadn't touched it. The static flickered for a few seconds, then steadied into a faint image. I could make out a living room, this living room, but from a different angle, like a camera feed. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. It was me, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the TV. And then, just as my brain caught up, the image changed. Now it showed me from behind. The me on the screen turned around slowly, facing the camera. And even though I was standing perfectly still, the version of me on the screen smiled. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. The air felt dense, like something was pressing against my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. The version of me standing there wasn't moving anymore, but the smile stayed. Too wide, too still, like a wax figure. I blinked, trying to shake the image, but when I opened my eyes, the screen was black again. Silence. I stood frozen, staring at the reflection of the room behind me on the dark TV glass. That's when I saw movement. Not on the screen this time, but in the reflection. Something pale and slow just at the edge of the hallway that led to the bedroom. It slipped back out of sight before I could focus on it. My first instinct was to run, but the door to the hallway was right next to that corner. My body wouldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to leave, to get out, but my legs just wouldn't respond. I took one step backward, then another, keeping my eyes locked on the hallway. That's when I heard it. A soft dragging sound, like fabric brushing against carpet. It was coming from the bedroom. I turned and bolted for the door. The knob wouldn't budge. My hands were slick with sweat, slipping over the metal. I pulled harder until it finally gave, swinging open with a groan that echoed through the apartment. I sprinted into the hallway, slammed my own door shut, and locked every bolt I had. Then I just stood there in the dark, my back pressed against the door, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound, just silence again. The next morning I called Carl. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, just that the seal on the door had broken and the TV was somehow on. He cursed under his breath and said he'd deal with it later that day. Around 3 p.m., I heard the maintenance key turning next door. I pressed my ear against the wall. I could hear him moving around, cursing about the smell again. Then, about 5 minutes later, the TV flicked on. I froze. I could hear the faint static through the wall, then a crash and a yell. Carl came out maybe 30 seconds later, breathing hard, his face pale. I rushed out to meet him. "What happened?" I asked. He just stared at me for a second, then shook his head. "That TV wasn't plugged in," he said quietly. "I checked it myself, but it turned on when I went near it." He didn't say anything else. He just left and never came back that day. That night, I couldn't sleep. The static started again around midnight, muffled through the wall like before. I pressed my pillow over my head, but it didn't help. It kept going, steady and rhythmic, until the faint sound of a voice broke through. "Don't touch that dial." Same tone, same calm, steady voice. Only this time it didn't stop. It repeated over and over until it blended into a low hum that almost sounded like breathing. By morning, the static was gone again. Everything was quiet. A few days later, a notice went up in the hallway saying the apartment would finally be cleared and released. I almost laughed. Who would live there after that? 2 guys from the city came to handle the cleaning and inspection. I watched from my peephole as they worked. About half an hour later, one of them came out looking sick. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. His partner came out a minute later, holding something, a small portable camera, dusty but still functional. He slipped it into a plastic evidence bag. That was the last time I saw anyone go in there. That night, I sat on my couch trying to convince myself I'd been imagining things. The exhaustion, the smell, the flickering lights, it all made sense if you pieced it together rationally. The human brain plays tricks, right? Especially under stress. Then a soft flicker filled my apartment. I turned toward my TV. It had turned on by itself. No remote in sight. The screen was dark at first, then static appeared. Brief, fuzzy, like a signal trying to come through. I stood slowly, watching as the image cleared. It was my hallway. Live feed. My blood ran cold. The angle was from inside the vent near my ceiling. I could see myself standing there, staring at the TV from above. The air conditioning wasn't on, but I heard a faint hum coming through the vent, like breathing. The picture flickered once more before fading into static, then black. I yanked the plug from the socket, but the screen stayed on for 3 more seconds, just enough time for one final whisper to come through. "You shouldn't have gone inside." Then it was gone. The TV went dark for good. I moved out 2 days later. Carl never came back to work. The new tenants arrived about a month after I left. I saw the ad online by accident. Newly renovated 1-bedroom apartment, includes all utilities. The photo showed the living room, same layout, same TV on the stand. And if you looked close enough, you could see something faint in the reflection of the screen. A man's face, smiling,